Hi everyone, it's Lindsay. Welcome back to another video. So a while back, I did a video all about the new Staz on Pigment ink, but today I want to share with you what coloring mediums this actually works with. So I use black ink when I am more than likely going to be coloring in my images. So that's what I'm going to be using today. I'll be using the piano black color in the Staz on Pigment ink. First thing I want to share with you though is not how I stamp these, but actually how I clean off my stamps. I used a red rubber stamp from Cracker Box and Susie Stamps. This is the large brushstroke stamp, and I use the Staz On cleaner. Now, I find this works best. You can use alcohol, but that can dry out your stamps. This doesn't seem to do it. So I'm going to go ahead and just take my little sponge dauber on top of this applicator with the Staz On remover or the Staz On cleaner and just dab it on the ink on the stamp. And then I take a clean cloth and wipe it down. Now you can see where that cleaner has touched the ink, it's removed it, but I didn't touch it right up top. If you don't get the cleaner on that particular ink, it's not going to come off your stamp. This will stay on there. It's not going to really transfer because once it's dry, it's set, you're good. But to get it cleaned off, you are going to need that cleaner. So let's move on to the coloring mediums. The first coloring medium I'm going to be using is alcohol markers. I stamp my stamp on pieces of plain white cardstock and also watercolor paper. Later on in this video, I'll use watercolor mediums. I stamped it twice using my Misty, so I got a good layer of ink on there. Then I'll be testing with different coloring mediums. Like I said, the first one is going to be alcohol markers, and I'm testing all in yellow, so this will easily show if it makes the color run. Alcohol markers, not going to work with this. The ink bleeds, it pulls it away, just not a good thing. Gets on the tips of your markers. Don't try it. Don't ruin your markers. It's not going to work. You can see clearly from the pictures. So let's move on to colored pencils. And I'm not talking just your colored pencils. I'm going to be using some OMS. You might know it as Gamsol. There's a lot of different names for it, but it's basically odorless mineral spirits. It is a blending solution that I use quite often to blend out my colored pencils, whether I'm using wax-based or oil-based. Today I'm using my wax-based Prismacolors. I'm going to go ahead and just on the right side put a little bit of color down. I like to see how this layers over the ink as well, see if it resists it at all. This layered just like any other ink would. Then I like to go and place a little bit next to the ink, and then I'll come in with my blending stump and my OMS and really blend that out. I like to go into the ink pretty hard, kind of a lot of pressure, a lot of product, see if I can get it to pull away at all. This did surprisingly well. I did not think it was going to work, to be quite honest. I thought it was going to pull out the color, but it didn't as far as I can tell. So, if you do stamp an image with this ink, it is going to work with your OMS. The colored pencils do layer on top of this ink too, so if you want a look like that, maybe no line coloring look, that will work as well. My next is going to be the Dove Blender pen. Now I use this with a few different products, so I'm actually going to go ahead and use it with my pastels or my chalks first. These are from Stampin' Up. There are many different places you can buy these now, but I don't believe Stampin' Up makes them anymore. So I'm going to come in with some yellow chalk, try and blend that out. And then I also use it with my ink pads. So I've got some Catherine Pooler ink pads. Normally I would do this on watercolor paper. But I did it on regular cardstock today. It's going to work the same way. This did not make it bleed at all. It worked perfectly fine with both the ink and also with the chalks. There's a closer look at that, and then let's move on to the next medium, which is ink blending. Now, I like to see if the ink is going to move at all, just with ink, and then I like to see how it reacts whenever I do a little bit of splattering to remove some of the ink with water. It's just something I like to do on a lot of my cards, so I like to see how the ink's going to handle it. I'm using Catherine Pooler ink pads. This is the Limoncello, and I'm using my Distressing Blending Tool. I'm using this because I like to go in with a heavy hand on this, really give it a lot of pressure, really try and move that ink. I should mention too, these are pigment inks. Don't try this unless you have heat set it. I heat set mine, all of them, before I came in and did any of this coloring. So make sure you do that whenever you are using these inks, or you let them dry for a considerable amount of time. They're pigment inks. They are meant to stay wet for a while. But that's great because you can heat emboss with them as well, which is something new. So I splattered those with ink or with water once I got on there. Once I got the ink on there, I did one on regular cardstock, one on watercolor cardstock. And what happened was it did fine with the ink blending. However, you can see on the watercolor paper or on the regular cardstock on the right, it actually pulled up a little bit of the ink with the water, which was funny because it worked fine with the rest of the watercolors, which you'll see in this video. So just know that if you do splattering, you might get little dots in your solid stamping if you do stamp with these. It happened with me on the regular cardstock, not so much on the watercolor, you couldn't see it as much, but on the regular cardstock you could. So my next coloring medium is going to be some pan watercolors. This is going to work the same with liquid watercolors, all your different watercolors. I just had my pans ready to go, so that's what I pulled out. I'll go ahead and do one on the left side with just a little bit of water, one on the right, really going in hard with the water. It worked fine. The ink stayed put, nothing moved around. And you can see it didn't really change color on me like it did when I did it on the regular cardstock. So just something to keep in mind. My next is going to be watercolor markers. I know, pretty much the same thing as watercolors. I get it, but I like to share all the coloring mediums because I will get a question about, well, what if this one will work and this one will work? So I go in with all my coloring mediums, so bear with me here. My next, or this one, I used my Arteza, which are a brush marker. I also went in with my Spectrum Noir, which are more of a marker tipped marker. So think distress markers, think your memento markers, that kind of thing. Now the Arteza are also similar to the Zig, so that's going to be your comparable marker for those. I went in with just the marker, no blending, then I came in with water on the other side, blended it out. They all worked perfectly. They didn't make the ink bleed at all. Again, make sure you're heat setting these before you try this. There is one final look at that. And finally, we are going to go in with watercolor pencils. These are fun. I love watercolor pencils. I don't use them often, but I'm going to try a few different things with these just to make sure it all works. So I'm going to come in first with a light hand, just with some watercolor pencil plain. I'll go in with a heavier hand as well. And then I'll come in on the other side. I'm going to go in with a lighter hand. And the left side, I'm going to keep just plain as is, not any water. This side, I'm going to come in with my water brush, go pretty heavy-handed, blend this out, see if I can get that ink to move at all. But there is also another technique you can do with watercolor pencils, and that is dipping them straight into the water and then coloring with them. You're going to get darker, more concentrated pigment this way. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I dip my lead into the water, colored on it, then I'll go ahead and blend that out. And again, worked fine, worked really well. I am working on watercolor paper with these also. So make sure you're using the correct paper for your coloring medium so you don't have any strange reactions. So what works? Colored pencils and OMS worked. My Dove blender pen worked. My ink blending worked on watercolor paper. On regular paper, cardstock, it left puddle marks. And all of my watercolors worked. Now what doesn't work is alcohol markers. So just to keep that in mind, whenever you are stamping with these inks, alcohol marker is not going to be your friend. That does it for me today. Thank you guys for watching, and until next time, happy crafting!